Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good, you?
Doing quite good. Can't complain. Wanted to get together, pick your brain today a little bit about concept of inadequate equilibria.
Yeah.
So I guess to get started, what's an adequate equilibria?
I think, as it's Yudkowsky's term, the inadequate equilibria, neither of those words by themselves. And in that context, equilibria aren't adequate by themselves. They are adequate to some particular task. An adequate equilibria is one in which a low-hanging fruit to a certain level is being picked. So in the stock market, if you are aware the stock is underpriced, if you have information, you can make money off of that in a way that corrects the stock, because you can buy a bunch of shares of the underpriced stock, and that will cause the price to go up until it hits the sorry, let me reorient. In general, certain structures have a property wherein there is no free energy. I'm sorry, I'm trying to reorient. Yeah. So in the stock market, if you are aware the stock is underpriced, you can buy the stock, and that will cause the price of the stock to go up, and so you can make money off of it. And so the stock market sort of resembles a busy sidewalk, in that you wouldn't expect to see $20 bills. I feel like I'm not explaining this very well.
That's right. Yeah. So let's start with the sidewalk example. That's the classic econ example, I guess. Let's say you're in Penn Station. There's tons of people, thousands of people walking through every day. And you see a $20 bill on the ground.
Yeah.
You think everyone's walking past, a lot of people are looking down. Generally, people will pick up that $20 bill.
Yes.
And it would be really weird if it stayed there for very long.
Yep.
Because, it's kind of like public information. Everybody can see the same sidewalk.
Yeah.
Everybody knows it's a $20 bill, and if they pick it up,
yes.
they benefit. So the stock market example you're giving, so the interesting thing about the stock market is, there's a lot of public information.
Yeah.
There are a lot of actors competing.
Yeah.
And so, like you said, if we spot and we see Microsoft stock is at $10, and we look at how profitable they've been, we determine really the stock should be $20. We can buy Microsoft stock, and then help correct that price, right?
Yes.
It would be because there's a lot of sophisticated people in the stock market trying to do this, trying to make money.
Yes.
All the information is relatively publicly available. There's special cases, but the SEC they really try. Yeah. The Securities and Exchange Commission really tries to make sure people don't make money with private information and things like that. It would be difficult to make a profit or make a lot of money in the stock market by correcting prices.
Yes.
Because all the profits get competed away.
Yes, because somebody else who knows what you knew has already factored that in.
That's right.
Given the number of people involved and the fact that the incentives are aligned so that you can actually make money by correcting the prices.
That's right.
So an adequate equilibria is a situation where it's adequate to correcting the prices, to consuming a certain amount of, Yudkowsky uses the phrase free energy, which is an abstraction and one I have trouble putting into other words.
Yeah.
But generally, it's a desiderata. If there is something that a lot of people want and they are all in a position to get it, then you should expect them to have already gotten it in the same way you don't see $20 bills lying on the sidewalk when you take a walk.
So like if we're walking down the sidewalk, a lot of people are walking down the sidewalk. Everyone can bend over and pick it up,
Yes.
We expect it will get picked up. It would be weird if it didn't get picked up.
Yes. Similarly, at the supermarket, you usually can't do very much better by going to try to find a new lane. Sometimes you find one that's just opening, but in general, if the lanes are open, then other people will have been looking to find the shortest lane, and so you can't jump ahead 3 carts in a supermarket line by looking for another line.
So you're mentioning you're at the grocery store and you want to check out faster. You obviously want to get home. Like this is just everyone's trying to get home as fast as they can to do whatever else is higher value activity.
Yep.
Everyone can see how many people are in each lane. So it's all publicly available information. So unless you have, so it's difficult to do better.
Yep.
Than,
because there are a lot of people involved and they know what you know. So you don't have any structural advantage.
That's right.
And I remember reading a argument that the returns to looking for a faster lane should always be just enough to compensate the very busiest people who have the most incentive to look for a separate lane.
Gotcha. So this is just like in the stock market.
Yes.
There's enough incentive to pay the professionals more than their next best opportunity.
Yes. So you end up with the stock market. You have stocks that are not predictably underpriced or overpriced, provided you can short sell.
Right.
With sidewalks, you have no resources, no money, but also not rare collectible baseball cards.
Right.
With the supermarket example, it's time. You can't get more time by looking, except just squeaking out some at the margin. And an inadequate equilibria is an equilibria that fails to achieve a particular level of this. So Yudkowsky uses the example of a treatment he looked into for his wife. She has very bad seasonal affective disorder. And he did some research and thought he had come up with a new therapy that would help her since the existing therapies were not working.
Right.
And he's not a doctor. So it is, from a certain perspective, you wouldn't expect him to be able to do that. You would think that all of the ideas that amateur doing research could find, doctors in the system would find, because there are a lot of doctors.
Right. So this, I love this example. I really love this example. And it was in Yudkowsky's book, Inadequate Equilibria. So the example is, Yudkowsky's, the author's wife, has really bad seasonal affective disorder, which is where you get depressed because you're not exposed to enough sunlight. And so he starts looking into this, and one of the options was he sends her to South America, pays and she flies down to South America and spends the winter there. That's really expensive. So he started thinking, what else could I do? And he looks into it, and he looks at traditional light boxes. That's the traditional therapy, is you put a lot of light and you look at it, and that helps. It mimics the sun. That's what you're doing, getting more sunlight. But he knows, maybe this is not bright enough. And so he goes out and he gets like these, super powerful LEDs, and he strings up like 10 of them or something, and like just, incredibly bright lights all throughout the apartment, strings them up, spends about $1,000, and suddenly, his wife feels much better all the time.
Yes.
No more suicidal ideation, so a lot better, doing a lot better, which is really weird because there are physicians, researchers, MDs, PhDs, who are selected for being the smartest, very conscientious people, that work on, SAD, seasonal affective disorder, exclusively. Why was Yudkowsky able to beat the researchers in their stated aim of, making a treatment for seasonal affective disorder that actually worked?
Because this is just rephrasing the fact that he could but the system was not adequate to that level. And the reason is going to come down to misaligned incentives, because you have a lot of people in the area who are smart, and this is not a very obscure idea, in that, if some light helps, you would expect more light to help more.
Right. This is fairly common sense.
Yes. And yet it looks like nobody thought of it. And this tells us that no one was incentivized to think of it.
Right.
Because of the number of people involved. If you have a committee at your workplace, and they are incentivized to think of good ideas, maybe that 4 or 5 or 12 people in the committee just won't think of the ideas.
Yeah.
But if you have hundreds or thousands of people in the system, then you can be fairly sure that they'll think of any obvious idea. And
these are smart people too.
Yes.
We should this is. I think that's what's good about this example. It's not like, these are experts in this particular field that
Yes.
dedicated a life. And how many years of education? 4 years of medical school, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of residency. Or research fellowships, whatever.
And it's, if he'd had a dream where a leprechaun told him to mix together certain specific chemicals, and he had done it and it had worked by coincidence, that would be one thing.
Right.
But he tried more of the thing that we know helps some.
Right.
Light.
Right. He just turned it up. He 10x.
So they are smart people. And they are conscientious people, but we don't even need them to be smart or conscientious.
Right.
So it's just very clear that this system is not properly incentivizing people to attain that level of rigor, kind of.
Right.
Because it isn't that it takes a creative leap. It's that they're not looking carefully enough to find that treatment, and it's a
Right.
pretty obvious treatment.
So I want to interject. So Quinn, is this what's going on? Are SAD researchers, seasonal affective disorder researchers, all these MDs, PhDs, are they optimizing on something other than curing seasonal affective disorder? So
Yes.
that's the stated aim. That is the stated aim, but the
Yes.
stated aim is not exactly. Maybe they're optimizing for publications in prestigious journals,
Yes.
or something else.
Yep. Institutional power, job security.
Job security.
Sometimes you get evolutionary dynamics, wherein the system itself selects people. So Pornell's iron law of bureaucracy says, I've heard it phrased a couple different ways, but it says that each organization is made up of some people who pursue the stated goal of the organization and some people who try to get more power within the organization.
Right.
And if you wait long enough, the people who are trying to get power will end up having more power. And so the organization becomes increasingly dominated by people who are trying to do things that are not the stated aim of the organization.
So so the the bad money crowds out the good, or something.
Yes. Well, I think of it like an evolutionary dynamic, in that there is something selecting the people who are going to have power, their desire for power.
Gotcha.
And so because that's being selected for, it eventually crowds out the other thing, even if that other thing correlates with it. When you read AI people, they talk about programming in a goal that correlates with the intended goal very well, but not perfectly. And it turns out that optimizing hard enough for the proxy decouples the proxy from the original goal. Guitar style.
Can you say that one more time? So,
If you program in, so I've seen this work through with a bunch of different examples,
Yeah.
and it's hard to distill all of them down to, because you keep feeling like you just have to add more details, and then that
Right.
keeps not working. But say you think humans being happy is good. I think that's not too controversial.
Hopefully most of our
So-
listeners would agree.
We program an AI, a powerful AI, to make people happy. If it's fairly weak, it might try, I don't know, giving them compliments, connecting them with potential friends or romantic partners. But once it becomes strong enough, the way to make the humans happiest is to administer them all heroin.
So you just run around the robot, just like it's just like stabbing people, trying to put in IV fentanyl
Yes.
or something. This is the best thing.
Yeah. Well, see, happiness correlates with what we want, but it's not all of what we want, because we don't want to be on heroin for the rest of our lives.
Right.
And it turns out that if it pursues our happiness, which is usually very good, it ends up the happiness is a proxy for whatever we really want. And pursuing that hard enough, optimizing hard enough on that metric, decouples the proxy. The tails come apart.
Right.
And this is significant because a market, or a structure like a market, which involves a lot of smart people pursuing the proxy, will reliably at least start to decouple the proxy. With sufficiently strong optimization, it will definitely decouple the proxy, but humans aren't AIs.
Right. This is this is very interesting. Like it's and really important. And I feel like part of this is why conceptually startups can even exist at all.
Yes.
Like it doesn't even make sense. Like why would like Microsoft,
Yes.
it makes billions and billions of dollars in profit. Why don't they just anything that's software related? Why aren't they just out there making these things happen?
Yes. Well, they're a moral maze. I mean, they have lots and lots of levels of middle management, which means they have lots of people optimizing for proxies that are decoupled from the things they're actually supposed to optimize for.
Right.
And, also communication difficulties, coordination difficulties.
Right.
Startups are more nimble, is the conventional
Right.
wisdom, and I think that's valid. You have a handful of people who really care about a thing.
Is this also something? Is there something else going on? This may be orthogonal and less important, but where startups, in the beginning, founders, even small units, and it could be more than one person. But you can think of them as monarchies in some sense. So
Yes.
they can get rid of anyone that is optimizing on power, not on the stated mission.
Yes.
And then you slowly have this degradation into oligarchy over time.
Yeah.
Where let's say the founders leave, and then suddenly it's people that are optimizing on power, not on stated mission, and it just goes down the drain over time.
Yeah.
Slow entropy.
You start with a benevolent dictator,
Right.
and you end up with an oligarchy or a bureaucracy, a
Right.
government by bureaucrats.
Right.
And, bureaucracy has a negative connotation, and it's worth noting. I think this is where that comes from. I mean, if bureaucracies were perfectly aligned to incentives, they would get things done very efficiently.
Right.
But as a general rule, they're not. We suck at that.
Well, they're perfectly aligned to the wrong incentives.
Yes,
That's
they
right.
are.
Like they're perfectly aligned to the wrong incentives, and not the incentives we want them to be aligned to.
No.
So I think this is really important because a lot of even I remember in Econ 101, you always the first thing you model is perfect competition.
Yeah.
Probably because it's really easy to model, and so we just hammer perfect competition. There's monopolies too, and oligopoly and all these things in between. But they talk a lot about perfect competition.
Yeah.
And where all the profits are competed away. But that's this is not exactly how and maybe that's orthogonal too. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with that. But just the sense that so when we think of things that work well, like the stock market
Yes.
works well, we think that transfers to everything,
Yes.
when very oftentimes it doesn't. Like I think the seasonal affective disorder example is really powerful because this huge gains
Yeah.
and relatively little, $1,000 and some sitting there thinking, what if we just had more light?
Yes.
Very bizarre to think about. I don't know, like just think about why people miss things, or incentivized to miss things, and also the difference between stated goals and actual goals.
Yes.
And the stories we tell ourselves about that.
Yes.
I think are important to keep in mind. I don't know. That's a web of ideas. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. It's a good web of ideas. There are a bunch of good ideas, and there are a bunch of relevant ideas in there. I think part of what I was saying about the iron law of bureaucracy, I was using that to introduce that sometimes it's the case that nobody in the system has made this discovery, like picking up a $20 bill.
Yeah.
And sometimes people may have made the discovery, but there are selection effects in place such that that doesn't reach the public. It doesn't become part of the public record. So it wouldn't surprise me if some doctor somewhere had made the same discovery Yudkowsky did, just because, more light is pretty obvious.
Right.
So there is some ambiguity as to where the system didn't let anyone discover that or didn't propagate the knowledge once they had. Because now that Yudkowsky has, I don't think the healthcare system is going to adopt it because he's not properly credentialed.
Right.
And that is, it's worth noting. It doesn't, it's non-obvious that when someone discovers a medical thing that works really well and helps people, that the healthcare system doesn't adopt that.
Right. It's very it's quite worrisome.
Yeah.
On many levels, right? I mean, it's quite worrisome on just so many levels. I think it's probably the case, right? If you explicitly asked, a couple of sad researchers, I don't know, it'd be really interesting to poll them. Like if we called them up and said, hey, like, what if you just like crank the light up? And they might be like, yeah, that could be the thing, but I can't get published on that axis or something, or there's something else going on, which is really bizarre.
My suspicion, which is not enough to explain it, but I think it's probably involved, is lawsuits and risk. Because it is pretty obvious. It's more of the thing that works.
Right.
I know I keep saying that, but... So, the fact that that discovery hasn't been put forward implies to me that there's some significant cost. Like, I have a difficult time believing that fewer than 1% of researchers working in this field would think of that.
Right.
I like Yudkowsky. I respect Yudkowsky. He has loads of non-obvious ideas, but this is really a pretty obvious idea.
As they go, apparently. Yeah. It wouldn't take... It's almost something where if you ask, like, it's like a kindergartner. It's like, what do we do? It's kind of like the pandemic. It's like, well, all these people, like, what should we do? It's like, well, maybe they should quarantine for 14 days before they come in the country. Like, I don't know. Like, it's not a high bar. Like, it's just not a high bar. It's like more light, right?
Yeah, it is. Which to me suggests they're not just unincentivized to discover it. There's some punitive factor on the table.
Right.
And, I sort of doubt that. I think if they tried it and something went wrong, they would probably not be legally liable. But if you're a doctor and you only do things you will probably not be legally liable for, you'll get one of those wrong.
Right.
And it will be bad for you.
You wouldn't play Russian roulette with that kind of thing.
No.
With your career.
Yeah. I think one of the things underlying the pattern of stagnation is risk aversion and lawsuits. I don't have the exact relationship between the lawsuits and the risk aversion figured out. Seems a little bit like a chicken and egg thing, where they cause it, but they're also caused by it.
Right. Yeah, I think it's... So I don't know... Here's one thing. Like, so when people talk about risk aversion and stagnation, I do wonder, like, are people really more risk averse than they were in the past?
Yeah.
And like at some like attitudinal level,
Yes.
that's my question. And that's like weird to me. But then I wonder if it's like it's almost like a compounding thing, and I don't know how this gets started. But maybe like if the world is more static, you become more risk averse.
Yeah.
And then because let's say the consequences for taking risks are increased. You have less chances. I don't know. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it does. Partly if the world is more static, then it's easier to feel like you don't have as much to lose. And it's easier to sort of internally stagnate, to get into a rut psychologically. Right. I think Zvi Mowshowitz calls it asymmetric justice. And I'm sure that that's a piece of it. That's where you are to blame for unforeseen bad consequences of your actions, but you are not symmetrically credited with unforeseen good consequences. And the result of that over time is to disincentivize all action.
Is that something where you are to blame if you throw the switch in the trolley problem? You're not really to blame if you let it happen.
Yeah.
So more people die, but you didn't cause someone to die.
Some of that, but also, if you throw the switch in the trolley problem and you save more lives, and that's allowed to count against the people you kill, then you'll be incentivized to throw the switch anytime you're saving more people than would otherwise be killed. So I think some of this is, we just had some people develop vaccines for the pandemic.
Right.
And I don't think they're going to capture a tenth of the excess value from that, what people would be willing to pay. Right. And, it makes sense that you're going to get people who are much more reluctant to take risks if they are responsible for the risks, but they only get to reap part of the gains.
Right. Well, that would be super interesting. I don't know. I should look this up, but I would be really curious to know how much the scientists who came up with the mRNA, the first mRNA vaccine, how much that woman got paid.
Yeah.
And how much is it? Probably, I guarantee it wasn't 10% of the net value. But if it gave everyone Guillain-Barré, some Q supporters would be hunting her down with rifles, which is severe punishment compared to the upside, which and there's just little upside.
Yeah,
I don't know, but I don't know how to fix scientists having upside and things like that.
No, I think sometimes it's really hard, and other times it's a little easier. Other times people are punishing them for things they really couldn't have foreseen. And it does seem to me that it is not good for us to stop doing that if we're not going to reward them symmetrically for things which doesn't, to the extent that it's something psychological, that's not going to help. Or it's not going to fix it, but it might help, because once you start looking for this asymmetric justice stuff, you see it just about everywhere. People are to blame for bad things that happen, and they aren't symmetrically credited with good things that happen. And so if you're a sad researcher and it occurs to you that this treatment might work, you know that if you give someone skin cancer, you have a very good chance of being sued and having your insurance go up. And if you succeed if the treatment succeeds and it helps, you aren't going to get symmetric gains from that. Right. And so anyone who cares about their career will get out of the habit of either doing that sort of experiment and to some extent even looking for that sort of experiment.
Right.
So I think that's enabling some degree of the psychological effect, because we're selecting very heavily for people who don't take unnecessary risks. Right. But I also think there might be a thing where humans use role models. So if all of the people who succeed in the field don't take unnecessary risks, where unnecessary risks are unnecessary to them, but sometimes very, very good for people as a whole, then, a lot of people are going to internalize that that's how you do the job.
Right. Yeah, and that actually reminds me of, even in the case of this, this is a very light example of this, but I think it's quite illustrative. Do you remember, it was a couple years ago, there was an econ blogger who couldn't get tenure or really had trouble getting placed in an academic job because they had a blog?
Scott wrote about that.
Yeah. I just wonder about that, and that's not even it's writing a blog, right? It's like that tiny norm.
Yes.
Violation is enough to.
Oh, not even necessarily. It's interesting looking at the pattern of norms. I mean, because I'm not sure that it always would have been a norm violation, or I'm thinking more of decades past, and decades past you couldn't do a blog,
right?
But I think there's an asymmetric incentive in terms of crowds. A mob can take things from a minority. I'm thinking of the nightmarish pogroms and stuff, but also much more mundane stuff. But a mob can't profit by coming together to bestow gifts. So you have hate mobs, but not love mobs.
Right.
And so in a certain kind of environment where you're not going to be rewarded for being singled out, but you have a strong incentive to be illegible and invisible. Benjamin Hoffman has an essay called Scapegoat Games, where he's talking about how in our current society being singled out is presumptively bad most of the time. Yeah. And so having a blog makes you stand out.
Right.
So, and if I cross that with Zvi Mowshowitz, which I think he would be okay with because they're friends. Mowshowitz thinks that to a large extent people are habituated to the moral mazes, to a system in which standing out is bad, to the point that writing a blog is bad because it signals that you're the kind of person who would write a blog, which means that you're not being prudent. And
right.
And I do see this, mentality in some places.
Yeah.
So to some extent, it's a norm violation because it's not smart, and it's not smart or not prudent, not appropriate, and it's not prudent because getting singled out is bad rather than good.
Right.
And people have adapted to that system.
Yeah. There's still something missing in my mind about how, and this is kind of, it's not entirely related, but I think it is related in an important way. It's still unclear to me why it feels like in the past we were more okay with people having different ideas than we are now. In the sense and we've talked about this before. You and I think explicitly have talked about this before. Peter Thiel talks about, most of these, the founders of the big tech companies having some mild form of Asperger's or something, where they just kind of can, in some sense, ignore, the social pressures to a certain extent. But I'm not clear why. I don't feel like it just changes because people decide we're going to start beating down, any nail that sticks up. So do you have any thought on why? How? I don't know. And why is always overdetermined. So
well, I'm in one of those places where I know that the model that we've worked out so far is incomplete because it's changing. and I don't really know why it's changing.
Yeah.
I can point to things that might be helping it to change, but I don't feel like I have enough of those to actually explain it.
Yeah.
Some of it is us getting richer, and so adapting to that.
Yeah.
And having more to lose and being more insulated from disaster. I don't think that's all of it, though.
Right. And just I want you to talk more on that, but I think it was in Scott's review of 0 to 1, and I get the sense, like, in a world like this where nails are beating down, if you can keep it to yourself and be in some sense and not get beaten down, being weird is almost an inexhaustible, like, it's a really good thing.
Yes.
Like because of, there are all these asymmetric profit opportunities.
Yeah, there are. And, if you're neurologically or psychologically weird, a lot of the times the kind of things aren't as much work for you. There are more work for other people. Other things are more work for you than they are for other people. But you can exploit the ones you're good at, and
Right.
you can delegate the ones you're not good at.
Yeah.
So to some extent, I think of it as I think of the market like a race, kind of. I'm visualizing a race from above, so it's an unusually simple race. And the market lets you come at it from a slant.
Right.
And having odd goals will do that too.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the time, if what you want is something that not a lot of our people want.
Yeah.
So both having a different tool set and having goals that you're not directly competing with people for.
Right. Well, but in some, yes, exactly. I think it's really important. Like, the goals that you're not directly competing for with other people, like, the more you can get away from competing. But it seems like it's almost, in some sense, it's gotten easier to make real progress because, if you're competing with a SAD researcher to create an actual cure for, or, real viable treatment for severe seasonal affective disorder, you've got this immense advantage because they're not really, like, the SAD researchers are not actually competing with you on creating a treatment for SAD.
Yes.
Which is very weird.
Yes.
Like, really, my mind, like, I think about this, like, this is just so bizarre. And almost like, I think you and I should try and get a SAD researcher on the podcast, because I want to understand, like, what's the explicit story? What's that you tell yourself about this? I don't know.
Might have more luck with an ex-SAD researcher.
Ex-SAD researcher. There you go. Banished from the academy.
Yeah, or just having less of an incentive to play politics.
That's true.
That is the problem. Scott Alexander has an essay where he mentions that in 2014, if you and your friends were being the experts, that was awesome, and it meant you'd done something good. And in 2021, if you and your friends are being the experts, well, it's just getting kind of sad now.
Yeah.
So I think he was talking about COVID specifically, but
right.
It generalizes. And so I guess that's me returning to what I said before, that it's changing. Some parts of it are getting worse, and I don't totally understand why.
Yeah. It's, man. In some sense, is expertise, like, are experts, like, somewhat overrated at this point then? Is this in fields that have been around for a while?
Yeah.
Is that something fair we could?
Yeah, I think so. I think human psychology would be enough to make it likely that they would be overrated, even outside of because humans have tribal chieftains, but science is relatively new. And so it seems counterintuitive to people that you would trust the physics experts about physics and not about things that aren't physics.
Right.
But I think further overrated because of what we're talking about.
Right. There could be really weird incentives.
Yeah.
Like, really weird incentives. one other example. Do you remember the infant formula example?
Yes. Yeah. Parenteral nutrition.
Yes. Can you talk about that at all? I can't remember the exact details.
Well, I'm not sure that I have the exact details either. I do have it on my iPad.
Nice.
But as I recall, it's another example of what we're talking about. It's a treatment for babies who are born with malformed digestive tracts.
Short bowel syndrome, I believe.
Yes. And so they need parenteral nutrition. They need sort of special nutrition. And we are using the wrong fats in the nutrition.
In the United States.
Yes. And this causes them to get brain damaged and sick and sometimes die. And we have excellent reason to think that we're using the wrong fats. It was approved by the FDA when we didn't have a good breakdown of different fats, and we kind of had fats are fats attitude.
Right. And the stuff we currently use and have been using, it's soybean oil. Tends to be, and that's what's approved is soybean oil.
Yes.
And it has something to do with omega-6 to omega-3, like that. Yeah. That breakdown. And if it's wrong, you get all these terrible developmental problems down the road.
So, yes, I found it.
Nice.
Basically what we've been talking about. So in 2012, there was a single hospital in the United States that could provide correctly formulated parenteral nutrition, the Boston Children's Hospital. The formulation was illegal to sell across state lines. So it looks like this one is on the FDA, which was the one they had approved. I'm parsing because it goes on for quite a bit. I'm trying to pick out which. A doctor who gives a baby a nutrition formula that isn't FDA approved will lose their job. A hospital that doesn't fire that kind of doctor will be sued. A scientist that writes proposals for a big, expensive, definitive study won't get a grant. And while they were busy writing those failed grant proposals, they'll have lost their momentum toward tenure. So we have, almost like dominoes, but in reverse.
Right.
Blocked. I think the example is he's using it mostly to demonstrate that this continues to be a concern even when the stakes are life and death and the people being killed aren't anybody's outgroup. Nobody wants to kill babies.
Right. No one explicitly wants this to happen.
Yes.
And yet. Well, and it's because, that if you give formula that's not approved and you're a physician, something happens.
Yes.
Get fired, lose your job. You've got to drive Uber.
Yes.
And it's a big status downgrade.
Yes.
For a physician. And it keeps going up the chain, right? The FDA, for whatever reason, they've got these weird incentives, can't do it,
Yes.
And then the manufacturers, they don't really have enough incentive to go out and do the study, and then it costs God knows how much to get it through the FDA, and it's just all this circular crazy incentives ends up with us, killing infants.
Yeah. All the way up the chain. And the FDA, I think asymmetric justice is at least part of that. FDA people have an incentive not to approve potentially dangerous medications.
Right.
And I think they also have an incentive not to acknowledge that they've made a mistake when it's something like this, even if the evidence is otherwise mounting.
Right.
Partly, I was reading, while I was listening, a podcaster I used to listen to did a read-through of the Gulag Archipelago. So
Yeah.
I haven't actually read, but there's this scene in it that they read aloud that stuck with me. It's the applause scene,
Oh, yeah?
where they have a moment of applause for Comrade Stalin, and it goes on and on and on because you don't want to be the first person to stop clapping. Similarly, I think the FDA, I forget exactly. Yes. Oh, right. You don't want to acknowledge that you made a mistake.
Right.
The first person to acknowledge the mistake is going to get scapegoated. So even if evidence is mounting from outside, they're not going to get rewarded for acknowledging it.
Yeah, and this reminds me, there's this great political science paper I read, it was probably a year ago, and so I can't remember quite all the details, but it talks about politicians apologizing.
Yeah.
And, it categorically just, does not work.
Yes.
Apologizing does not work. And so your incentive is actually just to, to not deny. You just keep denying. So, like you said, the FDA said, God dang, dude, we screwed up. Can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
We need to fix it. It's the front page of the New York Times, and they're like, we got to fire these people. And then, and the hospital's like, God, we're screwing up. This is bad. There's a great documentary. It's on, there's a fire in Romania. And it was at a nightclub. A lot of people died. And then the state health service kept all the patients in a burn unit, but there's all this crazy corruption, and they weren't taken care of properly. They should have been shipped. They should have sent them to Germany where they had the proper facilities. But it was a matter of pride that they didn't want to do this. We can take care of them here. And so they end up firing the health minister, and they get in someone who's, at least in the documentary, you get the sense his explicit goal is to clean up. He's trying to clean up the hospitals and admit we're wrong. And so, he's goes up there, he's like, we're terrible. The state hospitals, they don't work right. There's all this corruption. They're skimming money off the top. The cleaning agents they were using, they were diluting them to a point where they couldn't prevent MRSA. They couldn't clean the surfaces enough. And he was trying to go in and clean this up, and he's just unable to do it. I'm not exactly sure where I was going with that, but it's a great film. I'll have to include in the show notes. It just to see what happens if an actor who understands all these things tries to go in and fix it, and he's just completely unable. He's a patient rights advocate. He understands these are all the issues, and he's like, well, what if we go in and we just so they're using this cleaner. The cleaner's not working because it's the alcohol level is way too low to actually destroy any bacteria. So he says, well, can we just go in and remove it from all the hospitals? And his advisors goes, no, I'm sorry, that's illegal.
Yeah.
We'll get in trouble with the courts. He's like, can we get a court order? It's no, we can't really do that. So we just got to keep it. And it's man, at some level, you think if you're that guy, don't you just walk down the hospital and get your staff and say, we're throwing all this out? We're going to go pull it out. I'm going to walk down there myself if I have to. And I guess the incentives are, you just can't get hired again if you ever do that.
Yeah.
Is that what's going on? It's because there's points where Fauci, he could have done I'm sure there was somewhere things like this, there's small things we could do that would really help. But if I go against it and I actually make it happen, I just get fired and I can't get hired again.
Yes.
And you're optimizing for staying in job and doing you're still trying to, you want to do as best you can, but you're optimizing towards keeping your job.
Yep. And the jobs are populated by people who've made that decision. If you lose your job, you get to make that decision the one time.
You only get to do it once.
Yeah. And you get replaced by someone who will make many, many decisions. Right. So there's a almost evolutionary dynamic in play where making what we think of as the right decision means you get selected out, and you only get to make that one decision.
And so I'm sure the calculus you make in your mind is like, well, maybe I can make changes on the margin, and I know this is the wrong decision, but like maybe going forward I can make better decisions the next person up. And also, well, of course, what's really front of mind is like, I want to keep my career going.
Yeah. I'm not sure. That's something you could think. And if it's my model of humanity, there would be people thinking it. I read Zvi, and his model of the people who've ended up in charge is that their mentality is really strongly adapted to what you need to do to be in charge. And so they're unlikely to be trying to do the right thing. They're unlikely to be devoting mental energy to that.
So okay, that makes sense. So if it is a very competitive environment,
yeah,
you don't have time to even think about doing the right thing. Like this is like completely secondary to.
Yeah.
You have to it's competitive. It's like the like it gets competed out completely if it's competitive enough.
John Nurst, who we talked to,
Yeah.
he pointed out he has an essay where he speculates that a lot of the Asperger's stuff is one side of a bell curve, and the other side are people who are really skewed toward being social. I would like a word with fewer bad connotations than manipulative, but they're aimed toward dealing with other people. And we don't have a label for those people because if you're very, very good at dealing with other people, you're running the culture in the first place.
Right.
I feel like the people who are highly placed in the current system, in at least the most competitive positions, are likely to be way at the edge of the bell curve. And I think that not just out that bell curve, but in general, they're likely to be very extreme. And so I'm not sure that it works. I'm not sure this is productive to say, but I'm not sure it works to model them like they're trying in good faith, because it's simultaneously true that 90% of humanity is trying in good faith.
Right.
And, another 5% is just not trying, so they're not doing in bad faith.
Yeah.
And at the same time, these people are unusually likely to be derived from the remaining 5%.
Right.
It's complicated because it's not, I don't think they're just, psychopaths or whatever. But we could do a simplified model where making decisions just for power makes you more likely to end up in control.
Right.
And make 1% of the population psychopaths.
Right.
And you're going to see those people you're going to see leadership positions being controlled almost exclusively by that 1%.
Right. Well, and we can even think about this in terms of like competitive sprinting.
Yeah.
So this has been big in the news recently with drug testing stuff. But anyway, so we've got Olympic trials going on right now.
Yeah.
And if you're an Olympian, you need the genetic talent, predisposition.
Yeah.
You got to have the fast twitch muscle fibers. You have to have, your pelvis has to be built a certain way.
Yes.
Like all this genetic stuff. And then you have to spend every waking hour, essentially every waking hour,
Yes.
Optimizing on this one thing. Like,
Yes.
And because it's so competitive, you have to like train right, you have to eat right, you've got to, have a good plan, you got to be smart about it, you've got to, and you've got to spend a lot of time doing that. And so at the end, like, because it's so competitive, the more competitive it is, the less time you have there's no slack. There is just no slack to do anything else. Yeah,
very much like that. Or like, suppose we were talking about Fields Medal winners, and I was saying it's neat that they persevere through all that boring math.
Right.
Because, most people find math kind of boring. Some people don't find it. But my guess is that very, very few Fields Medal people find math even a little bit boring. And politicians, for instance, are national level politicians and people who end up running the CDC and are similarly really heavily selected. And it's harder to say because I don't think they're just psychopaths, but I think I believe they have a mentality that is entirely geared toward winning zero-sum status games in the symbolic social realm.
Yeah.
So, the head of the FDA does not know the babies are dying. You can't tell them the babies are dying. They'll process that as a social signal or some part of a coalitional power game.
Yeah.
And it sounds like I'm dehumanizing them. But I'm not doing that gratuitously. I think that if we expect that they are trying their best, that we will be badly wrong again and again and again, and we'll make bad predictions.
Right.
And I think that's consistent with a world where almost everyone is trying their best.
Right. And it's not the case, and maybe you are saying this, but I don't think you're saying this. It's not the case that they're even, like, in some moral sense trying to be a bad person.
No.
They're literally just optimizing. Like, they want to win.
Yes.
They really want to win. And they're optimizing on whatever it takes to win.
Yes.
Whatever game they've selected there.
I'm thinking, I don't have direct evidence for this. I play video games. And there's a funny thing where when you start a video game, you're thinking about how to play it. And then it sort of fades into the background. You know what the jump button is.
Right.
And then you can get to a level where you couldn't tell someone what the jump button was, but your hand just does it.
Right.
I think that a lot of people who have risen to the top of moral mazes are similarly, their brains are they're just executing the right social move.
Right.
Instinctively, reflexively. In sort of the same way. And I don't know how to communicate that the way your brain can run almost a different program, a different game in a totally compartmentalized way. I don't have a non-video game example, and not everyone plays video games.
Right.
Driving, maybe?
Yeah, driving.
I think there's something like that going on.
Right.
I think there would almost have to be.
Right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it does speak just so many levels. Advice I draw from this, like life advice, is you should always be really concerned about hyper-competitive environments.
Yes.
And you should always, as best you can, and this scares me to death. Like, I literally, like, which I think is good, because I think if you're scared about things, there's a chance you can ameliorate them and, like, work on them. But, like, doing something that, like, you got to make sure you're optimizing on the right axis.
Yes. Like,
you need to think about this a lot. Like, and yeah, I don't know. Like, it's really quite scary, right? I mean, like, no one's setting out to make this. No one's setting out to have the infants die. You know what I mean? And then yet we end up. Yeah, I don't know. It's quite horrifying, right?
Yeah, it is. I think Moshowitz says that if you were picking something to keep you up at night, this would be a good candidate. I agree with that.
And it is much scarier than explicitly bad people or something like villains, like movie villains. Because, at least this is in some sense like, well, you can get rid of the person, and then that's a much more solvable problem than, like...
Our mentalities, human mentalities, are so well adapted to dealing with villains that we read stories about them for fun. I mean...
Right.
We really want to do that the same way we want to eat lots of sugar and fat. And just like eating lots of sugar and fat, sometimes it's the right thing to do.
Right.
If you never ate any sugar or fat, I think that would not be good for you. But this is scarier because it's something we're not adapted to doing. We're trying to do it manually.
Right. Backing up a little bit.
Yeah.
You remember the post-conflict versus mistake theory?
Yes.
So we've been talking a lot about, I'll try to summarize this as quickly as I can. Mistake theory is kind of what we've been talking about. Everyone's like trying to optimize on something. They're not explicitly trying to do something bad, but they end up doing something bad.
Yes.
Conflict is like, well, sometimes people actually do things
Yes.
to try and win like a conflict, and they're actually trying to do something bad. Do you think it's a bias that we have? We're high systematizers, like I would definitely be biased towards mistakes theory.
Yeah.
Do you think we're biased towards mistake theory too much, and that conflict, we should think more about conflict theory, or is that like, you think we have it properly weighted?
Scott's essay ties together a bunch of different qualities.
Yeah.
And he shows how they correlate. Each of them is explained as a cause of the previous quality.
Right.
But they're not logically identical. And once you have something that correlates with something so I think of them as a cluster.
Okay.
Rather than a single thing. And I think some aspects of that cluster we're doing the right amount of.
Right.
For all I know, some of them we're not doing enough of, and some we probably are doing too much of.
Right.
His basic one-sentence definition is conflict theorists see the problems of society as primarily being about conflicts, evil people doing things who
Right.
we have to, and mistake theorists think people are making mistakes, and some. When he draws out the correlations, you have conflict theorists to a large extent eschewing discourse.
Yeah.
And eschewing truth-seeking and eschewing Voltaire-style liberalism and debate.
Right.
And I think that part is definitely a mistake.
Yeah.
But I think trying to understand clearly both the existence of conflict theorists and the existence of people who have bad goals that are not consistent with our goals anyway.
Right.
It's important not to be blind to that.
Yeah.
I think there's a party game called Werewolf or Mafia.
Yeah.
And I've never played it, but I've read essays about it.
Yeah.
It's played with a group of people, some of whom are secretly werewolves.
Yeah.
And most of whom are villagers. And the villagers have to try to detect the werewolves.
Yeah.
I'm wishing I'd played it. I'd have a better idea of how it works. The remarkable thing about it is how well it aligns a set of incentives. If you're a villager, you want clarity.
Yeah.
You are in conflict with the werewolves, but the optimal strategy for you looks remarkably like the sort of liberalism that Voltaire or Bertrand Russell brought to mind.
Right.
You want clarity, you want coordination, you want communication. And if you're a werewolf, you want discord and confusion. Right. And you want to gum up the works of coordinating as well as you can without tipping your hand that that's what you're trying to do. And the reason it's bad to tip your hand that that's what you're trying to do is that it identifies you as a werewolf, and that makes you a target for coordination, and you would end up incentivizing the coordination.
Got it.
So I see that framework as sort of, I add it to Scott's conflict mistake theory. And I'm okay for my personal, in the service of my own goals, for my own ethics. I'm okay being a conflict theorist, but I don't act as a werewolf, ever.
Right. I really like that.
I think very few people are trying to do the wrong thing terminally. I think some of them are trying to do the wrong thing because it's the wrong thing instrumentally. This is another Zvi Mashowitz thing, that doing the right thing creates ambiguity about why you did it. You might have done it because it was the right thing. And so if you're trying to signal, say, loyalty to the group,
right,
you need to take actions that are the wrong thing.
Right.
I also think a lot of people are applying high-level heuristics rather than reasoning about the physical world.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. And just mentioning, so like doing the wrong thing just to do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Example of that, and I should get a example for the left too, because this will sound like I'm picking on somebody. But, so anti-masking.
Yeah.
Like masking, it's a low-cost intervention. Yes. Even though the data, it's not super clear. It's common sense. But,
Yes.
it reduces some viral load.
Yes.
Because you've got some physical barrier. Like I said, low cost, easy to implement. Probably helps, and so it would be rational for people to do it, right?
Yep.
But not wearing a mask is signaling an affiliation with the in group.
Yeah.
That is not costless, and it's like probably not the right thing to. It's not the right thing to do.
Yes.
And so you see that a lot.
I think so.
I don't know.
I think that's one thing driving that.
Yeah, at least part of it. And we've actually talked about some other reasons recently.
Yeah.
But perhaps less related. I want to talk about one more thing.
Yeah.
Before I let you go. So when we think of like these kind of like collective action problems, like where like the incentives are just not strong enough, like so the baby formula, a cure for SAD. Perhaps the baby formula example is better for what I'm trying to get at here. And I haven't thought about this too much, so we'll see where this goes. But what do you think can be done? So, like, like example of the baby formula, does it taste someone who's like relatively rational and has a lot of money and can just like put in place, and like make this their one issue and then go solve it? Is that what it takes? Like how would you go about even fixing a problem like this? Do you see what I'm saying?
I don't know. It's an important question.
Yeah. Like so, for example, we had Eliezer Yudkowsky on the podcast.
Yeah.
Recently, I talked to him, and he's starting an organization. It's called New Science. It's a nonprofit. You should check it out. And his idea is to create kind of a new, kind of an exit institution for science. So there's like an institution with different incentives than scientists currently have. Could it be something like you make finding a cure for SAD actually what you're optimizing for?
Yes.
So like maybe you like put up just like a straight up bounty and you say like, if we gave you $50,000 for a cure for, SAD, right?
I bet that'll help.
Would that help? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would help. Gonna get expensive fast. But
Would get very expensive fast. That's a real problem.
Yeah. It's kind of a cop-out, but there's what we're doing now. There are lots of people involved in the system who are taking actions that are net bad. And the more clarity we have about that, ideally we would stop with the asymmetric justice or cut it down, so
right.
We reward people for doing good things, and we
punish them less.
Yeah. I think instrumentally, for political change, you probably need the populace to have some idea. And for the populace to have some idea, you need some degree of clarity that, say, the FDA knew this thing was killing people and let it happen. And I find that a little bit distasteful because I'm adding more blame to a system that's already really, really full of blame.
Yeah.
But it might help at least a little bit.
Interesting.
I do... I think a lot of this does rely on some degree of ambiguity, but I also don't know how to... the public isn't my weapon of choice, and I don't really know how to talk to them.
Right.
I have a very strong instinct that creating clarity is good, that has both locally beneficial effects and that the unforeseen effects skew positive.
Interesting. So is it something like making explicit, like more explicit, like talking about like what people are actually optimizing on in a given time?
Yeah. What they're optimizing on. What we can conclude, what we have good evidence for.
Yeah.
I really wish I had something better than that.
Yeah. It's very difficult, and I put you on the spot there. But
No.
I do think it is also an argument for, like things happening on the edges. Like
Yeah.
it's probably easier. It's probably easier.
Yeah. There is, there's also creating a whisper network. Like people who have problems with seasonal affective disorder can read about Yudkowsky's stuff even if they can't get it through the mainstream medical system.
Right.
And, to some extent, you could theoretically have a long-term, you could have an increasingly developed informal set of communication until it supplants the formal set. I think something like that either has happened or is in the process of happening with Wikipedia.
Got it.
I mean, it started as, nobody took it seriously.
Right.
And now I think most people take it seriously. I don't know if I'm not saying they're necessarily right to do so.
Right.
But
it definitely is getting more, like, it's common. It's like, especially like pages with a lot of, like pages with a lot of people editing it and like working on it, like you can get pretty close.
Yeah.
Like you have the knockdown drag out fight about like, any given topic.
So I guess that's another strategic avenue. Create the better incentives informally and position them to take over formally once it becomes obvious enough to enough people. And that part I don't know how to do. That they're working better than the institutional incentives.
Right. Yeah. I think that makes sense. Any other concluding remarks? I know we've talked about a ton today.
No, I can't think of anything.
Cool. So I'll put a link to the book, Inadequate Equilibria.
Yeah.
Quite recommended. It's not a long read either. It's
Nope.
good. It's a good book. There's also a good book review if even that's too long. I'll put a link to that too. Scott did a good book review on that, I think. And we didn't even get through all the stuff about the outside view. Well, I guess in a roundabout way we've kind of talked about it, but perhaps a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Quinn, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives.